This video is brought to you by the Professional Photographers of America. Join a community of over 35,000 photographers and find equipment insurance, education, and business tools made specifically for small business owners like us. Welcome back everyone. In this video, I'm going to go over how I've set up the new Canon R5 Mark II for my use in the studio. In part 2, I'm going to go over how I've set up the camera for video as someone who is a hybrid shooter. Okay, let's go ahead and set up the camera step by step. I've got an Atomos recorder here plugged into the camera so you can see my menus in real time. You might hear a fan noise, and that's because I've got the cooling fan grip on this camera. So one of the first things I'm going to do is turn that fan off. But first things first, we're going to reset the camera. All right, so the camera's done. I'm going to go ahead and tell it that I want it to be in English. I'm going to skip the date and time, and I'm just going to come down here and click OK. It's going to ask me to set up a smartphone. We can do that maybe a little later. I'm going to hit cancel. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in here to the menus and get this fan turned off. So I got to head over to the wrench menu. Then I'm going to come over here to the fourth screen and click on cooling fan settings and turn this to off. So if you want to know about how setting up this grip for shooting video, watch part 2, which it'll be about video settings. Okay, I'm going to grab my notes here. We're going to go step by step. I'm going to cover the things that I'm changing in the camera from the factory default and not the things that I'm not. That way we'll speed things up and we won't be here all day. First thing, I'm going to go back over here to the camera menu, if you will, the very first one. And I'm going to change the camera to shoot CRAW. So I've used CRAW for the last 2 years basically, rather than regular RAW, and I find that there's really no difference functionally for me. I know that I have heard that there is a functional difference if you blow the exposure by a lot, but I try not to do that, so I'd rather, save a lot of space. So I'm going to turn JPEGs off as well. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is go to the third screen here, and I'm going to come down to the color space, and I'm going to make this into Adobe RGB. Now, the reason for this is that Adobe RGB has more information than sRGB, the default, and I believe this only affects the JPEGs, but I want to get as much information as I can. If you're doing a web-only workflow, let's say, you might want to skip this and just use sRGB, but I'd rather have more info from jump just in case and then change it later. Also here on the third screen, we're going to turn off the auto lighting optimizer. This is sort of like an auto levels thing that it applies to the JPEGs. I don't want that. I want it to give me the real image as I shot it. So we're going to go to the fourth screen now, and I'm going to come down to the white balance, and I'm going to take it off of auto and put it into daylight. In the studio, I shoot mostly daylight. I will make adjustments though in post using Capture One usually, minor adjustments, but this is where I like to start out. Now I'm going to go over to the sixth menu, and I'm going to come down to the drive mode, and I'm going to set that to high. I really don't want to be shooting really high frame rates in the studio usually, so I think this will be just fine, but we're going to change it a little bit later. Now I'm going to come over to the shutter mode, and I'm going to set this as mechanical. The reason why I'm doing this is because in the studio, there's no real advantage, let's say, probably to using the electronic shutter. The electronic shutter is really good for shooting fast frame rates or perhaps being quieter in some instances, but we're going to be using strobes most of the time, and we're going to be waiting for those strobes to recycle, so there's no advantage. In fact, there's a disadvantage with the electronic shutter. At low ISOs, you get slightly worse dynamic range, and I'd like to have the best image possible, so I'm going to stick with the mechanical shutter. Then I'm going to come down here to release without card, and I'm going to set it to disabled. The reason why is I don't want to take any photos without a card in the camera, because what can then happen is that you could be doing an entire session not tethered and then end up with no photos at all, and that's definitely not something that I want to do. So the next thing we're going to do is come over here to screen 7 and we're going to change the IS settings. And I see that I'm using a lens that isn't compatible. Right now I've got the 35mm 1.8 on here. I'm going to need to grab another lens. So I'll be back in just a second. Well, I've got the 85-1.2. I hope this is big enough for the camera to have this functionality. I guess we'll find out together. I've been using this lens as my primary lens in the studio, and the reason why I grabbed the 35 today is because I figured that, you know, it's little and it won't take up a lot of space here, and it also won't be gigantic and get in the way of me tipping the camera. Let's go ahead and go back to the menu system. I'm going to click on the IS image stabilizer mode, and I'm going to turn it to on, and then I'm going to go to still photo IS, and I'm going to say only for one shot. My understanding is that this will cause the image stabilization to be on while the images are being taken, but not before, and this will save power in the long run and get us steadier photos. However, if you're shooting on a tripod all the time, maybe you don't need this at all, so that's something to think about. Let's look at our next setting here. We're going to go to screen 8. I'm going to click on image review. Review duration is going to be set to hold. And viewfinder display is going to be set to enable. So what this is going to cause the camera to do is it's going to play the image back for me, and it's going to let me see what I just captured, which can be great when you're using strobes and you want to make sure things fired and everything. However, if you aren't using strobes and you're shooting a lot of frames, I actually found this to be quite distracting because that image pops up and then you have to tap the shutter button again to get it to go away. And so I wouldn't quite recommend it, but if you want some automatic chimping, if you will, where your photo is automatically showing up on there, then I would set it to be enabled. That way you can see it, but if it bugs you, just disable it. Now let's come down to high-speed display, and I'm going to turn that to on. So what this does is it enables the viewfinder, the electronic viewfinder, to refresh quicker, which is going to give you smoother looking motion. So if you're photographing dancers, let's say, their movement will appear more natural. And so that's why I would use it in the studio. Next, we're going to come down here to display simulation. And I'm going to set that to exposure only during depth of field. Now you're probably wondering, what does that mean? Well, by default, your camera is going to show you what you see is what you get, but that can cause problems in the studio. Because when we're using strobes, our camera might not necessarily recognize that we are using strobes, and it might just show us a black picture because the settings we have set up for our exposure are going to result in a black frame if there are no strobes. So by having it set to this setting, we won't get that black display or viewfinder. We'll just get an automatically adjusted image that will be the right brightness for us to see what's going on. And then if we aren't using strobes and we need to know what the available light is doing, all we have to do is press this button right down here, the depth of field preview button, and that's going to show us what our exposure would be at the current settings without flash. So I think this would be a great setup for, let's say, a wedding photographer where you're bouncing back and forth between available light and strobes. And that way you can sort of have the best of both worlds. It will auto adjust for you. And then when you need to check your exposure, you just press the button down here with your ring finger and it comes up. Now, some strobe triggers will tell the camera that you're using strobes and it might auto adjust for you, but this setting will be a good way to go. I have this happen all the time when I'm teaching workshops. If you want more information about those, just go to johngress.com/workshops, where people will come with their camera and it won't, it'll be set to that automatic, what you see is what you get setting, and then they got this black frame and they don't know what to do, and so I have to change it, and I have to change this all the time on Canon cameras, Nikon cameras, and Sony cameras. I practically know the menu system for all of them, unfortunately. So that's why I would set it up to this setting. So the next thing I'm going to change are our frames per second. You're probably wondering earlier why I had the drive mode set to high, because on strobes that's going to be like, and we don't want that. I'm going to set it to single. The reason why I had to have it to high earlier was because there were certain settings that can only be adjusted when you're in that mode, and maybe when you're in high, and maybe we're going to need that stuff at some point later in the future. So that's why I did that. And if you're buying new gear like this, then you're definitely going to want to insure it, and that's where PPA, the Professional Photographers of America, comes in. As a PPA member, you'll automatically get $15,000 worth of equipment insurance, and there's only a $350 deductible and a $50 deductible for repairs. But PPA is more than just insurance. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting out in your photography journey, they've got educational and business resources that can help you out a great deal. Plus, they have a vibrant photography community. So to save $25 on your full PPA membership, just click on the link in the description and sign up today. Now let's go to the autofocus settings. So the very first item here in the settings is the AF operation, and I want this set to servo. I know it's the default, but I just want to say this sort of as a PSA. I see photographers in my workshop doing this all the time where they have this set to one shot, and it causes a problem because what one shot does is it establishes the picture in focus one time and it doesn't focus anymore after it does that until you release the shutter fully and then start again. And the problem with that is that when you're photographing people in the studio and you're not on a tripod, they move a little bit and they can be out of focus. So if you don't have this set to servo, then the camera won't continuously focus on them or it won't track them, and that'll cause a problem. Also, if you're not shooting on a tripod, you're going to move. You're going to just lean back a little bit here and there, and that's going to cause some autofocus issues as well. Having it set to servo will ensure that your pictures will be in focus regardless of if you're shooting at f/16 or f1.6. So that's a good thing just to keep in mind and keep that set up to where it is by default, which is servo. Now the next thing is the AF areas, and by default it's set to 1. I want to change that to the whole area. And the reason why is I don't want to be restricted as to how the camera is going to focus and where it's going to focus, because I don't know where my subject's head, or subjects plural, where their heads are going to be in my frame. I want to use the whole area, and that's going to be important. All right, so coming over to page 2 here, subject detect is set to people by default. If you're photographing people, make sure you're on people. That will set you up for success. If you go and shoot animals or cars, just make sure that you switch it back to people. Now, coming down here a little bit further, I want the eye detection to be set to auto. This is also the default, but I just want it to be able to find the eye that's closest to the camera and focus on it, and that'll ensure that your photos will be in focus. If you're having difficulty and you need it to focus on the left eye versus the right eye, you can set that up and however you need to do it. I wouldn't set this to disable. I use this feature all of the time and I absolutely love it because it, with the 5D Mark IV, maybe I had when I used a prime lens like this wide open, maybe 30% of my shots or maybe 50% of my shots were out of focus. With this camera, I could shoot wide open at f1.2 and every frame would be in focus. So that's definitely something that you want to make sure that you've got set up when you're photographing people in the studio. Now we're going to come over to page 4 here, and the very first option is servo first image priority. And I want to make sure that that is going to prioritize focus. The reason for that is we're in a studio environment and we need things to be in focus. We don't need to prioritize getting a moment, which is what would happen if you were saying release. You might feel differently about this, but for me, if it's not in focus, there's no point in shooting it. So that's why I've set it up to this setting. All right, let's come over here to the network settings. And I'm going to come over to page 2, and I'm going to come down to connect to smartphone tablet. Then I'll click on Camera Connect and add a device to connect to. And then it says once the camera is paired, it stays connected even when off. So this is great because our camera and phone will stay connected all the time. So we're going to click OK. And then it asks us to use our camera. And I'm going to grab my iPhone here. Then it asks me to go to a web page. It's going to ask me to download the app, but I've already downloaded it. We'll go through the motions. And I'll click open. And agree. And agree. Oh, I need to say next here on the screen. It says to start the Canon software on the smartphone. I did that. It says detect camera. Let's say yes. We'll click pair. Then the camera asks me to click yes or set to connect. Okay, it says it was successful. Let's click OK. We'll also tell the camera OK. And now let's just look and see if we can access the camera right now. It's going to ask us to join the network for the camera. We'll click join. And now our connection has been established. And we're able to change the settings on our camera from our phone. Let's go ahead and back out here to the main menu, if you will. I'm going to click on Functions, and then I'm going to come down to Camera, Date, and Time Settings. So what it says here is that when automatic setting is turned on, the smartphone's date and time setting is automatically applied to the camera when it connects to the smartphone. So I'm going to click on that. All right, so this is great. So every time my camera and my phone connect to each other, it will update the time in the camera, and that will help me get accurate, photo generation times. If you've ever shot weddings and had two cameras that are on different clock times, it can be very bad because you'll go to organize the photos by capture time, and then they'll be out of sequence. So this will help keep you in the proper sequence no matter what you're doing. All right, now we're going to go over to our next settings, and that's here in the wrench menu. I'm sure it has a proper name, but we'll come down here to auto rotate, and I'm going to set this to be on for the computer. All right, so by default, what happens is if you shoot verticals, they're going to come up on the back of your camera and display, and the way that you would look at them is by holding the camera in this orientation. But if you're shooting verticals, that's probably not what you're going to be doing. You're going to be holding the camera like this, using the proper grip. Maybe you're holding it like this. But regardless of that, with the settings that we just put in the camera, what's going to happen is that the images are going to display on the entire screen in the same orientation that you were holding the camera when you took it, and that's going to make reviewing the images a lot better because they're going to be bigger and oriented the correct way, so you don't have to spend your whole day flipping the camera over to horizontal, which should be very, very annoying. So that's why I've set it up for this. Next, we're going to come over to the third screen, and I'm going to set my screen brightness to 3. Now, the reason for this is I find that I'm constantly underexposing my photos with that default setting. And by doing this, my photos will appear dimmer on the screen, and hopefully that will help me, get a little more meat on the bones when I'm exposing my photos. And maybe instead of being 2/3 of a stop underexposed, they'll be correct. Hopefully, that's the idea behind it. Then I want to come down to Customize Dials Control Ring. And then I want to come down to the Lens Control Ring, and I want to set that up to AV. So now what's going to happen is that my lens is going to, this front ring here is going to act like an aperture ring, which is what we used to have on the lenses in olden times. Now the next thing I'm going to set up here is on screen 2, and it's called Touch and Drag AF. I want to set it to enable, and then I want the active touch area to be the bottom right. So what I just set up here is so that when you're manually selecting the focus point and looking through the camera, you can do so by pressing your thumb to the lower right-hand corner of the display. And that way you can just move that focus point around and get it to wherever you need it to be. So the next thing we're going to change is the eye control, and that's on screen 4. And I'm going to turn it to be on. So this camera has a new feature which allows the camera to track your eye and where you're looking to set up the subject that you want it to track. So in the studio, I found that I like to shoot with the camera away from my eye, and I like to just look at the screen and have it find the person's face and focus on them. But when shooting an event, I did use this eye control, and I found it really helpful to be able to indicate which subjects I wanted to look at. And I could look at the subject, press the button halfway, and it would start tracking them. I found this to be pretty helpful. when having a lot of faces in the screen. It took a little bit of getting used to. It wasn't flawless, but I think after getting used to it, I think I could use it really well. When I was photographing just one person though, in a pretending to work out in this lifestyle shoot that I was doing at a gym, it was kind of annoying. So I definitely would want to be able to turn it on and off and use it in different use cases. And I think like all the features in this camera, there are particular use cases that are going to be good for you, may not be good for others, and that sort of thing. So the next thing to do would be to calibrate it, and you would just press start and look through the viewfinder and look around and look at the things that it wants you to look at, and it'll get a calibration for your eye. And that's how it will work. It won't work while I have it plugged in here to the external recorder, so I'm going to skip it, but that is the setup and how it would work. Now we're going to come over to the final group, and that is to set up the My Menus tab. This is going to be quick things that you can get to that you have to change all the time, and it's a customizable menu just for you. So I'm going to say Add My Menu tab. I'm going to click OK. And then I'm going to click on Configure, and then I'm going to click on Select Items to Register. So what I'm looking out for here is battery info. That's the very first one that I want to add in here. All right, then I'm going to click on Register and click OK. Now I'm going to go to my next one, which is Shutter Mode. I know that's at the very beginning. And I'm going to click that. That'll let me switch between electronic and mechanical. Next, I want to find screen brightness. And I'm going to go ahead and register that. This will allow me to change the screen brightness when I'm shooting outdoors. And the next thing we need to add in here is eye control. And we'll add that. And okay, so now we'll back out. You can see my menu. You can see how everything is set up here. You can see my battery info for both of my batteries. Thankfully, I'm still almost at 100% after doing all of that setup. But this will allow you to shoot in the studio. And or at least this is how I've got everything set up for me to shoot in the studio, and hopefully it will help you make your decisions as well. Well, I think that about wraps it up. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those below. Also, please click on the link in the description to get a $25 discount on your PPA membership. If you're interested in setting up the camera for video, be sure to watch part 2, which I'll be posting in a few days. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon.